study of failed civilizations, Jared Diamond concludes that most collapsed because the people held on for too long to belief systems which had previously served them well. Today we face this threat for the first time on a global level. So clearly 50% of babies born today will not live to be 100, to quote one prediction from yesterday, unless we manage to reverse environmental destruction and especially climate change, which threatens everything we have so far achieved and everything we still hope to achieve as a human civilization. Of those who've studied climate change, climate threat in detail, it's the optimists who fear that we're heading for growing global resource wars and refugee floods unless we change course drastically over the coming few years. The pessimists, like Anthony Giddens, after all the author of The Politics of Climate Change, former director of the London School of Economics, fears that life on Earth could end, that runaway climate change could be triggered, which basically would turn the Earth into a copy of Venus in the not distant future. So people of course know about this, and that's why the pessimism is growing. A Pew study last year found that in the USA, 62% thought that their children were going to have it worse than they were having, only 33% thought they were going to have it better. The percentages who thought their children would lead better lives was 28% in Germany, 17% in the UK, and 9% in France. So I believe these people have a right to expect a more serious and urgent response from their intellectual elites than the often naive technological optimism we hear, including at this conference. Interestingly, Eric Schmidt, the CEO of Google, in his latest book, highlights some of the threats of this new technological internet age. We cannot anymore expect, our children certainly can't expect, to lead undocumented lives. Everything you've ever done, said, every picture taken will be preserved for posterity. He also warns that somebody who tries to stay away from this, somebody who tries to stay offline, will be seen by the authorities as an increased security risk. They face increased security checks, boarding airplanes, etc., if your life is not completely online. Of course, Schmidt is also realistic enough to realize that not everything can be done online. He travels through the Arab world, reports that how the Arab Spring was triggered, by people's abilities to communicate, but then he writes, of course, your smartphone will not occupy the Interior Ministry for you. If you actually want real change, you're going to have to do it yourself with your physical body. Another reality check I think we need to be aware of is we are not as rich as we think we are. We are facing increasing stranded assets. Much of the wealth on which our pension funds, our investment funds are based on, consists of resources like oil and gas, which we can never use unless we want to destroy the basis of life and a healthy environment, a healthy climate. When Swiss financial managers were told of this in a symposium a few years ago, which dealt specifically with this peak oil issue, they said, well, if this is true, we're lost, because 70 to 80% of the values of our investment funds are based on the expectations of future capital flows of income on an economy assuming to have continued access to cheap energy. Also, we have accumulated more debt than real wealth for the past decades. So we've accumulated claims on future wealth, which basically cannot all be paid. They're going to have to be cut because there are more claims than there's wealth. We're going to have to face deleveraging. We're going to face conflict claims because you cannot really invest for the future. This wealth has to be produced in the future, and there are just, as I said, too many claims. Amory Lovins, one of the pioneers of energy preservation, energy saving in the US, once said that markets are good servants, they are bad masters, and an even worse religion. And we have to realize markets, of course, are social constructs. There are many different kinds of market models. Anybody who says, the less government, the more market, the better, I say, well, go invest in Somalia then, where there's no government, because they're not very keen. The current model has clearly failed. Nicholas Stern, after all, a former chief economist at the World Bank, says climate change is the greatest market failure ever. The US economist Herman Daly calls it a huge accounting error. The World Future Council last year did a study where we looked at the costs of not using renewables. You might think, well, of course, it's a climate cost, etc. But there's another cost. The sun shining every day, if you don't tap it, you've lost it. The sunshine of today cannot be tapped tomorrow. So we said, how do you calculate that waste, that loss of natural capital? Well, one methodology we came up with, look at the fossil fuels which are burned unnecessarily because they could already have been replaced by renewable energies. And of course those fossil fuels have a value for the petrochemical industry of future generations. And we found this annual waste of natural capital came to about over $3 trillion a year. So we need to rethink everything, all our institutions, our policies, everything we do. Al Gore wrote this in a book in 1992, before he became vice president. Because we are facing new risk hierarchies. And that's, again, often missed. People talk about, financial crisis and threatening, but, the worst financial crisis, a state bankruptcy, we've had lots of those in history. Countries overcome them sometimes in years, and most maybe takes a decade or two. But an environmental collapse can take thousands of years to overcome, if it's at all possible to overcome it. You can negotiate with your financial debtors. You cannot negotiate with melting glaciers or spreading deserts. Nature provides no rescue packages, so it's a totally different category here. So, as we are here, as we are guests here in Montenegro, maybe we should try to use our this reality check to try to come up with some answers to the challenges here. Montenegro has declared itself the first ecological state, and it has a national strategy for sustainable development. The first thing it calls for are internalizing production costs, making sure we know we don't externalize them at the expense of future generations and the environment. And that's something everybody agrees on, from the political right to the political left. The World Future Council works directly with policymakers worldwide, so our focus group are actually the people who have to implement this. And when we brought this to our network of policymakers in Africa, they said to us, well, if we try to abolish petrol subsidies, we'd face a revolution. And of course, when the president of Algeria tried to do that, and in Sudan, they almost did face a revolution. They had to backtrack. Even just with petrol prices. So, you have the problem that if you internalize costs, they have grown to such an extent. We have subsidized fossil fuels, we are subsidizing so much. Most of business, current business, would actually go bankrupt. Puma tried, they did a study, what would it cost them if they internalized all the production costs. They found that profits would have fallen by 75%. But they were very lucky because, Puma is a high-value company with goodwill, and, goodwill by itself doesn't produce CO2 emissions. So clearly most companies would not survive. So what is the answer to this? Well, the answer is an integrated solution. Indonesia tried it. They haven't quite succeeded. They had to backtrack, but it gives you an idea. They had these huge riots, as I said, in Sudan, in Nigeria, and Jordan, where they did. So when Indonesia realized they had to cut, for economic reasons also, petrol subsidies, the fishermen could no longer afford to go out fishing so far in their motorboats. So they fished closer to the shore. But of course, closer to the shore, there's less fish, otherwise they wouldn't have gone out so far. So the government had to help them to increase the value of this smaller catch by building fish processing plants, so they would sell processed higher value fish products. This gives you an idea of the complexity of this thing, this problem which everybody agrees in. Of course, let's internalize the costs, but the consequences are staggering. Also, the Montenegrin plan talks about accelerating growth, economic growth. But what kind of growth are we talking about? Herman Daly's pointed out that increasingly the growth we're having is uneconomic growth. It actually costs more, it's taking care of the consequences of past growth, and it costs more and more and brings less and less. In India, they call it commiserating growth. People see GDP going up, see production going up, prices are falling, and farmers are committing suicide. So what does it mean in practice? Well, of course, it means, for example, if you have rising sea levels, and so you have to use labor, resources, cement, etc. to build protection, to build walls against these rising sea levels, you can't use the same labor and the same cement and steel, whatever, to build housing for the next generation. So it's not a question of money. Money, is never the issue. The issue, of course, are raw materials as in the real economy. So what can you do about that? Well, first of all, you drop GDP, which is basically almost a meaningless concept. You can have it for academic reasons if you want to, but you develop indicators which show real, sustainable quality of life increases. Then, Montenegro wants to complete the transition to a market economy. But again, the key question is what kind? Now you'd probably say, oh well, Germany is the best example, but Germans don't think so. In an opinion poll late last year, it was found that Germans are so disillusioned that the majority of Germans would prefer an economic system organized by the state rather than a market economy. If you don't believe it, Frankfurt Allgemeine Zeitung, 27th of November last year. So what's gone wrong? Well, first of all, we don't really have a market economy. As the American economist, Harvard Business School professor David Corton writes in When Corporations Rule the World, we actually have economists planned for the benefit, not of the people as a whole, but planned for the benefit of large corporations. That's the first challenge. Second, finite resources. Chandra Nair, who advises the Chinese government from the based in Hong Kong, say there is no physical way China per capita resource consumption can ever rise to the level, not just of the US or Western Europe, not even of the level of Taiwan. It's physically impossible. The Chinese government is aware of that because they have to look at these challenges. But Nair can come and speak there. He can go into Abu Dhabi and he can speak. And he said, there is no human right to own a car. There can't be a human right to own something which is physically possible. So I said, have you ever tried to say this in the USA? He said, yes, I did. And what was the reaction? They called me an environmental Taliban. So, Americans now buy twice as many items of clothing as they did 20 years ago. Not as, 40, 50 years ago, not 20 years ago. Because the ruling credo there is still that of Paul Masur, one of the early marketing gurus, who wrote, we must shift America from a needs to a desire culture. And clearly this doesn't work as a global model. The third point, Pavan Sukhdev, who went from Deutsche Bank to advise UNEP on the cost of biodiversity destruction, he points out that discounting the future, which our whole economic system is based on, assumes that we will be richer in the future. He says, but if we're actually going to be poorer in the future, we should have negative discounting rates. Now the implications of that for our economic calculations are, mind-boggling. But I think we have to realize that despite it being mind-boggling, we have no choice. Ecological civilization is not one option among many. It's the only one. And of course, this is increasingly realized in many countries. There's been a lot of speculation in media about why has Iran now proved more willing to, change course on the nuclear issue. Was it some US pressure? Was it sanctions? Was it this? They overlooked one important reason. If you actually read what the presidential advisors say, they have realized they have more important worries. And I quote from one of them last year. Our main problem that threatens us in Iran today is not America or Israel, but the issue of living in this country. The Iranian plateau is becoming uninhabitable. End of quote. So what are some of the cornerstones of this new human story we now need to tell and live by? Firstly, our starting points can never be values-free. There is no view except from the viewpoint. It's our basic worldview, one of mechanistic materialism, where in order to realize yourself you have to accumulate as many material possessions as possible? Or is it one of a living universe? Do we see ourselves living in a living universe or not? To prove one or the other is basically impossible because we need to be outside it, and we're not. So we have to decide on our starting point. Secondly, we're told whenever you have some great proposal you've thought through and you come and you present it, you're told with a sort of smile, well, it's very nice, but there's no money. Who's going to pay for it? We have an economic crisis, etc. Of course, nonsense. What are actually the steps to get there? And the most important steps are, of course, policies. Policies, laws, regulations, are the strongest incentives for societies, for markets, for individuals. As Martin Luther King once said, laws may not move the heart, but they restrain the heartless. The World Future Council has for the first time published, you see copies at the back, you probably already got some, the Global Policy Action Plan. What are the minimum number of different policies in different areas where we need change, which really exists in most cases,
in order to make sure that we haven't solved, not to solve all our problems, but at least making sure we're on the right course, that at least solutions are growing faster than the problems are. And we divided them into 7 key chapters. The first one is on learning and responsible governance. It covers issues like education for the public, but also especially for economists and business schools, political funding, and question of progress indicators. Number 2 is equity and dignity. It covers issues like human rights and responsibilities, the need to have representation for future generations and to outlaw crimes against future generations. 3, peace and security, redirect military spending, banning nuclear power, banning nuclear weapons as a sort of overriding, not really a weapon, overriding threat to our long-term, short-term threat to our future. Chapter 4 is on climate stability, best policies to promote renewable energies, growing as fast as possible, full energy cost accounting, green building codes, what are the best examples worldwide, and of course getting rid of subsidies. Number 5, healthy ecosystems, the right to food and water, what are the best policies there, what are the best policies protecting biodiversity, forests and oceans. Chapter 6, Commonwealth, money creation, absolutely key issue. How can we shift that? Creating new money against new performance, i.e. against new goods, new production of new goods and services with capacities, with spare capacities, is not inflationary, and absolutely key truths to remember. We need green tax shifts and green budgeting. We need to make sure that the financial instruments finance the real economy, and if not, just either ban them or don't give them legal status. We need to make sure that our savings don't threaten us, i.e. divestment. Very good examples already exist. And lastly, enterprise and design, the cradle-to-cradle model, which was mentioned already yesterday, of designing products to make sure that they can either be recycled or reused. And also the top runner, a Japanese principle, where the least efficient products have to be destroyed every year. And lastly, to create so-called B corporations, benefit corporations, a model they have developed in some US states, that you can create corporations which have broader goals